Okay, so I had a presentation put together for you guys on agroforestry as a whole, and it's just not popping up today. And so I'm gonna pull this one on silvopasture, and then I'll talk about some of the other agroforestry practices at the end. Silvopasture is a topic in agroforestry that has been met with some enthusiasm in some camps and some resistance in other camps. And it really is the idea that we can have livestock and forest kind of utilizing the same spaces. And so we'll go through kind of the basics of this. And then at the end of this, I will talk also about some of the other agroforestry practices, which include things like windbreaks, our non-forest, our non-timber forest products. So things we can grow in the woods like mushrooms and ornamental pieces, woody florals, medicinals, or other things that kind of fall in that category. And then there's two other pieces of agroforestry, which include riparian buffers and odor slash windbreaks. So we'll talk about those as well. I just don't have any fancy slides on them that I can find this morning on my computer, which they were there this last night when I put this together. Just a quick overview. If you're new to Women Owning Woodland, this program that we are, it's still in development, but offering opportunities that provide learning, opportunities about natural resources topics. We say woodlands, but I usually include things like invasive species, wildlife. So really it is on natural resources topics. We put together field days, lunch and learns, and classes that we gear towards women forest landowners and enthusiasts. Facebook page that's provided that I try to put, I'm the administrator for that page. And so I try to put up as many opportunities from myself and from other organizations that do have kind of a women focus. I also share some that, again, have sort of that general audience, but might be of interest to you all. And so I don't have much coming up in the works. We are doing a food plot workshop. Again, that's not really a Women Owning Woodland. It's a general audience that will be coming up next week. It's a virtual food plot workshop. And then kind of looking further down the road, in June, I will be partnering with Pheasants Forever, Quail Forever to again do a WOW / Women Caring for the Land field day. And that'll be offered at we're hoping, fingers crossed as we're working out those details, it'll be offered towards the St. Louis area. So if I have anyone in that area, that will be coming up. And then if you're thinking about your fall and you happen to be in the northeast part of Missouri, I'm partnering with Iowa and Illinois to do a Women Owning Woodland field day in Keokuk, Iowa. So if you're close to that area, that's coming soon as well. So just a few things that are coming up. Okay, so let's talk silvopasture today. So this is an agroforestry practice, and agroforestry is when we try to put in place practices that, again, have an agricultural benefit, but also have a forestry tree related piece to it. And this is really, Missouri has become actually a showcase of agroforestry practices. The University of Missouri has an agroforestry center that does a lot of research that falls, again, under this cover of agroforestry. Silvopasture is one of them. So we have created the Center for Agroforestry at the University of Missouri. And then through extension, I try to provide as much information to landowners or clients that are interested in agroforestry practices. This is one that, again, is where agriculture meets our forestry practices, which is not too far-fetched. So a lot of our early forestry practices emulated our agriculture practices, and so it just was a long game. So instead of having planting a crop in the spring and harvesting in the fall, with some of our our forestry and silviculture management, we planted a crop and then we waited 25-50 years to harvest that crop. So again, not too far-fetched, but we have figured out ways where we combine the two things to get results in both angles, relatively shorter period of time. So silvopasture is one of them. And this is a field that it had a lot of interest, probably in like the 80s, 90s. And then it kind of lost interest for a little bit. And now it's another practice that is gaining more interest again. And so again, we're going to define silvopasture today. We're going to recognize management system components and talk about the benefits of silvopasture. So for years and years and years, foresters have promoted and told people to keep their cows out of the woods. And now we're kind of saying like, well, maybe if we do it in a practical way, in an organized way, maybe it's okay. So silvopasture should not be mistaken for just like opening your woods and letting cattle graze in woods all the time. So most of our silvopasture that is successful is a very targeted grazing in a forestry system, and it does require quite a bit of oversight. So to make sure that those that our livestock don't do too much damage to our trees that we also have in place. So again, what is agroforestry? The intentional combining of agriculture and working trees to create sustainable farming systems. There's my fifth one I could not come up with, which is alley cropping, which is another one that is really interesting for folks that have kind of more orchard-like forestry settings. So that's really using planting trees first and foremost, and then planting a secondary crop underneath it. And this has become, we have some work that's been done in walnuts. So I talk about black walnuts a lot because I do the black walnut syrup, but they're a fantastic tree for alley cropping because they get their trees much later in the spring. And so things that could get established underneath them before they leaf out. And then they also lose their leaves earlier in the fall. So this provides kind of some open areas for us to think about putting other crops underneath it. So, and then the other four that I've talked about. So forest farming is going to be those non-timber forest products. Windbreaks, it also includes odor breaks, and then riparian buffers. And today we're talking about silvopasture. All of these practices, again, rely on one thing, which is trees. So that's what they all have in common. And they are all definitely finding their place in agricultural systems, especially as we work to make agriculture more sustainable. And we think about how we can farm, but also continue to have wildlife diversity and still have our property or our land allowing for those ecological services. So this was really a catchphrase. Probably 10 years ago, we talked a lot about ecological services. And so this is really a term for, anything that natural resources do for us. So things like water filtration, or pulling nutrients from water, or making oxygen for us to breathe, providing space for habitat for wildlife. So those are ecological services. And so we are really working hard towards meeting, again, the needs of our human populations from the farming perspective, but also, again, continuing to maintain the integrity of ecosystems as we move forward. And this is really a nice place that agroforestry kind of fits in. So silvopasture is combining timber, livestock, and forage production on the same acreage. The trees will provide the long-term returns, while livestock and forages generate an annual income. So this has, again, gained some more steam, particularly in pine plantations and pine silvicultural systems. It also has been popular in South America. So they have used silvopasture with some success. So the benefits of this, and I'm probably jumping the gun on my presentation, but benefits are that we provide high quality forage, which is, but it's underneath trees. And so our trees are going to continue. We usually, again, pine is very popular for this practice. We also can use some of our veneer quality trees that have a little bit higher value, or even thinking further, we can think about perhaps I planted a black walnut plantation with the idea of veneer further down the road. But in the meantime, I want to figure out some type of rotational grazing system underneath those black walnuts. And then we can actually go even a step further and think about things like nut collection from those walnuts. And, again, new to us, or to our thinking of this, is we can also put in the black walnut syrup system. So we're getting a lot of value from the property that we have in this type of setup, but we're also still providing good filtration systems for riparian areas, because we have trees in place, and those deeper roots can help with our again, water quality services. And we still have a lot of canopy that's going to provide resources for wildlife. We might have, again, if we're producing nuts with this silvopasture setup, we might fight some of our wildlife for our product. But again, we kind of have that nice interface and sort of kind of come up with a compromise with this type of system. And so again, sometimes it's also hard to get into the tree business knowing that your returns are not going to be seen for perhaps 25, 50 years. And so if we do silvopasture, we can have a more annual return, which also helps with forest management, because forest management can be expensive. And so if we can find a way to generate some income from the property to help pay for forest management practices, perhaps in other parts of the farm, or even in that particular system, that can be of a benefit. Silvopasture is not woodland grazing, it's not forest grazing, and it's not range grazing. And so this is just a fancy way of saying we don't just put livestock in the woods and say that it's silvopasture. It is a very targeted and well thought out practice. And so again, here's some pictures of what it's not. So we don't ever want to be in this situation where we have a lot of compaction and damage to our trees because we have livestock in the woods, and we're going to call that, forest grazing or woodland grazing, because this is going to kind of defeat the purpose of this practice. And so if you have a livestock in the woods for extensive periods of time where they overgraze, they're going to start to damage the trees. There's going to be a lot of soil compaction, which is also bad for tree roots. So you're losing the benefit of having those trees there as far as your long-term gains from them. And then if you look here, this is kind of an example of woodland grazing. And so from the livestock perspective, you're gaining very little by putting this cow in those woods, because there's very little for it to eat in that particular situation. So it is, again, a pretty well thought out system so that there is good quality forage for your livestock, but we're also producing good quality trees that meet our objectives on that side. The components are usually trees, forage. So again, livestock needs something to eat in that understory. So they need some type of, and I'm certainly not a livestock person, but they need some type of high quality forage that's going to provide a benefit as far as like weight gain and development for those whatever livestock. And I have cows here, but some of our silvopasture systems don't utilize cows. They'll use other livestock such as goats or sheep can also be used here. So, and then again, that third component is whatever livestock that you have. One of our researchers actually at the University of Missouri, she is getting ready to do some silvopasture research, which will be really interesting for us to provide some Missouri-based silvopasture information to producers. And she's kind of doing so, and I'll give you just kind of broad overview of what they're looking at. In the past, we have had cost share available through NRCS for silvopasture, but the idea was that you were taking pasture and planting trees, and then going about doing this kind of targeted grazing on it. Her research is kind of looking at the opposite, and so it is taking forest that perhaps is marginal forest, perhaps it's been high graded in the past, and it's just not providing a lot of benefit to the landowner other than perhaps, just having forested area. And so to kind of, in some cases, our producers are going to try and make that into pasture regardless. And so her research is hoping that by implementing type of a silvopasture system, so it's being thinned, and then we're putting forage underneath it. But finding that research and providing that information will help encourage producers, rather than just like completely cutting every tree down, bulldozing that area and planting crops and hoping to provide quality forage there, that they will consider leaving some of those trees and doing the forage underneath in the silvopasture system. So that's one of the projects we're working at through the university to find some information for producers, because just putting livestock in the woods on a full-time basis is not good for anything. So it's not good for trees. Usually it's not, again, good for forage production, and it's not, your livestock are not getting a benefit from it other than the shade. So that's a big one, is providing shade for livestock as well. Again, types of trees that are very commonly put into silvopasture are a lot of the pines, particularly in the southeast part of the US. We have some of these systems set up because pine down there is important to their timber industry for quite a few purposes. It's also an important part of their ecosystem there, is that pines are very native to southeast, very common. But then hardwoods, so that's where we fit most of the time in Missouri. Not that we have shortleaf pine as our native pine when you get to southern Missouri, and we could support some of those silvopasture systems. We just don't purposely plant a lot of pine in Missouri because we don't have a great timber market for it. So unless you just really like shortleaf pine, which it would be awesome if you did just love shortleaf pine, because it is our native pine, and it's good for us to have even more of it as part of our forest systems. But most folks want to have some type of benefit from the trees that they plant. And so hardwoods are more common for a Missouri silvopasture setup. So this can include oak trees, particularly white oak, if you're thinking long-term veneer stave timber that has a lot of value to it. Walnut, so there's a picture right here in the middle, that is actually a black walnut silvopasture setup from our research farm that's up in Boonville. You can also, so nut trees, fine hardwoods, that's usually what's used. And I know I always show pictures like, oh, it is established, but the trees do, when they get planted, they do have to be protected from livestock for a while. So there is usually some type of fencing system that's going to keep the livestock from damaging the trees while they're in development. And then once they get to kind of, they have a good bark protective layer, their root systems are well established, then we don't have to worry about protecting them as much. And in some cases, like with this black walnut plantation, you can see here, instead of actually putting livestock into the system and grazing them directly, they will do some haying underneath. So collecting that forage and then feed it to livestock in another area. So that's also a possibility with this practice. Types of forages, so cool season, warm season, from a natural resources and wildlife perspective, if you can put this type of system in place and also use native warm season grasses, that can provide a lot of benefit to wildlife, as well as to livestock. And so especially, again, my specialty is in forestry and wildlife, but on our grazing side, there's been a lot of research being done and promotion of native warm season grasses because of the benefit that they provide to wildlife, but also to livestock. So again, if you're not into livestock, you may not know, but most of our forage that's in a pasture is going to be a cool season grass. Most of it's going to be fescue. And so when the temperatures get really warm come July and August, those grasses don't grow as well. And so warm season grasses can actually kind of help our livestock get through some of those warmer, drier times that we see, because they're adapted to this environment. And so they grow really well, and then they provide a benefit as far as protein and nutrition content. Again, livestock that can be put into these systems, cattle, goats. In fact, goats are actually almost a little hard on this system because they prefer woody plants. So they love things like poison ivy and multiflora rose. And so they can be, you wouldn't want to put goats into a silvopasture system until a little bit, unless you have more established trees, because they do really enjoy eating woody material as opposed to just grass. But we do use goats, which is a whole kind of a whole other topic, but we do use goats for controlling sometimes understory invasives that are of the woody type, because they do a good job cleaning that up. Sheep can also be used here, horses. We've had cases of poultry, so free range poultry can be put into these types of systems, and then any type of specialty livestock that might be of interest. Again, benefits. So we see a lot of improved plant vigor and lower animal stress in silvopasture setups. So even if we decided to keep a more traditional pasture setup with like cool season fescue, the amount of shade from trees can actually improve the vigor of that particular pasture setup because of the shade. Reducing wildfire risk. So if you look kind of through some of these silvopasture pictures, you'll see there's a lot of green grass, which is less likely to catch fire. Trees are a little further apart, giving a little bit of space for that. I certainly don't promote this as like we need to convert everything forested in Missouri to silvopasture. But if we're thinking about like we do need to have some type of income and we are producers on our property, this is got some good benefits to it. Again, improve wildlife habitat, annual income. So perhaps again, owning property certainly does not come without its expenses. So trying to find places that we can again maintain some of our ecological integrity, but also having a little bit of income for that property. This can and may be a practice that would be of interest for that. And then long-term income. So from the trees, these can provide some of those long-term benefits. So again, I always jump the gun describing these things, but we have seen in our silvopasture systems faster tree growth, healthier trees, some improved nutrient cycling, some higher quality forage, and then lengthened our forage growing season. So again, just kind of these two, having your forage and your trees work together can improve both of them. In our livestock. So again, if we do this right, we don't just turn them loose in the woods and call it silvopasture, but we can see increased weight gain, increased milk yields, higher consumption rates, and lower veterinarian bills. And this is just simply because a lot of this has to do with the environment, the higher quality forages, providing shade. So again, summer in Missouri can be rough on our livestock when they're in full sun. And so that shade ability is great. Wildfire risk. So again, we have our lower stand density, fewer ladder fuels, a little bit less fuel loading. So again, this really pertains to a lot of our southern US silvopasture, which is where we've done a lot of experimentation with this, and that can help with that wildfire mitigation. For wildlife, so this can be more sufficient food supplies, suitable cover, well-distributed water, and then some adequate habitat. So again, livestock don't, when we do this in a like really organized, best for everybody fashion, our livestock don't spend 365 days of the year on this forage. So this is usually combined with a rotational grazing system. So we'll move livestock in and out in kind of a flash grazing. So they'll graze for a few days and then we'll move them out. And this allows time for whatever type of forage we have there to recover, to grow. We can also plan this around particular wildlife benefits. So, and again, this does get tricky because you have to have enough property to make this feasible for landowners, which can be of course, one of the difficult parts of this. But like, for example, during nesting seasons, we can keep livestock out, like early springtime, we keep our livestock out of those particular areas. So our turkeys have good nesting success. And then, maybe we'll turn cattle back in there late summer, especially if we have this seeded in like native warm seasons, it's a good time to put the cattle in there because it's shaded for that late summer heat. And our forages usually are doing really well if they're, again, those warm season grasses that do better with drier conditions and with the hotter conditions. So again, a big benefit is the annual and long-term income. So just, being able to have some income from livestock or from just forage production. So again, in some cases, they'll just hay underneath their silvopasture system and sell that. Again, this is something that's not taken off in Missouri yet, but in our pine plantations throughout their growing, so pine have just a different rotational makeup than our hardwoods, but they also get some income from raking pine needles. So it's very popular for pine needles to be used as a type of like garden mulch, landscaping mulch. And so this is something they've been doing at our agroforestry center, is they've been kind of tinkering with pine mulch as a feasible income for pine owners. So again, just something kind of think about down the road. They do annually sell their pine mulch just kind of as an interesting practice, and it always sells out right away because people like to use it in landscaping. So again, just an interesting, in Missouri, we're an interesting state. We have the northern part of the state, which is a little different than the southern part of the state. So, and then of course, our long-term benefits, which can be logging. So again, it is an agroforestry system that can be economically viable, can provide wildlife habitat, can be environmentally sustainable. It is possible for us to produce livestock and timber using the same ground. And it does have that aesthetic and recreational value to it as well. And again, reducing that wildfire risk, which in Missouri, we're very lucky that we do not have quite as much wildfire risk as some of the other states. But if we can keep it that way, that's always good too. Here's like some extra information. So if you're looking for more information about agroforestry in general or about silvopasture, here's links. I would, if you're really interested in any of the agroforestry practices, the Center for Agroforestry, they have their own website. They also produce a quarterly newsletter as well as podcasts. And then coming up pretty quick, I think it's coming up on us in May, they actually have what we call the Agroforestry Academy. And this year they are doing, so it used to be, again, pre-COVID, it used to be a 1 week kind of intensive training. So you went and you stayed, they had used dorms on campus, and then they would take you different places to look at agroforestry practice. And they did all the training. So they talked about silvopasture and windbreaks and forest farming and all of that in a week. And so, which was really nice. And now, again, we're kind of post-COVID. They've kind of redesigned a little bit. So they're going to do an online component for like 1 class a week. And then at the end of that, they're going to convene all in one place and do some of the hands-on learning pieces for that. So It does have a fee, but it's if you're, again, interested in any of those practices, it's definitely worth it. And then there's the Association for Temperate Agroforestry, which is where we're at as far as being in a temperate deciduous forest. And then our NRCS has some information on silvopasture and other agroforestry practices. And they are an organization that is definitely getting, it seems like they add a little more all the time to their agroforestry information and some of the, even some of the cost share that can be used for agroforestry practices. So if you're interested, good resources, and I can put those, after I quit sharing, I can put those websites in the chat as well. As for other, and because I advertise this as an overview of agroforestry, so I don't want to not give you any information about the other agroforestry practices. So, and we've talked about some of them in here in past lunch and learns. So things like tree syruping, that is a practice that we put under agroforestry. Cultivating mushrooms is another practice that we put under that forest farming agroforestry practice. Other practices like windbreaks. And in Missouri, we use windbreaks and sometimes like odor breaks. So in particular for some of our other like agricultural practices like dairies or hog operations, in order to, again, think about environmental health, they will plant trees as an odor break. So kind of when the wind blows, it hits those trees, and that kind of keeps it contained. Same thing for windbreaks. So again, southern Missouri, we don't have worry so much because we have a lot of hills, but when you get up to northern Missouri, it is a benefit and helps with wildlife, but also with erosion issues to have kind of forest woody shrubs planted in between row crop fields. And this is, again, going to help with things like erosion, water control. So it's going to catch any, when we row crop, we have fields that are kind of exposed. And so when they get rained on, this carries sediment and causes erosion, and those breaks will kind of help slow that process, as well as like slow the wind down, which helps kind of just overall with protection of our soil resources, but also provides a good wildlife benefit, because we know that deer, turkey, quail, like they like some of that woody cover, and they're not just going to hang out for long periods of time in completely open row crop fields. They need places that they can go and hide and forage on other things. So in particular, like during the winter, deer and turkey in particular, they are going to use a lot of seed sources from our like native trees and other woody shrubs, because our row crops are not going to be available for them to graze on. And in particular, farmers don't always want them to graze on their row crops. So they need to find other sources of food, and that's what those breaks can offer. Riparian buffers, so also kind of the same thing as helping with those row crops, but keeping our riparian areas planted in trees / woody shrubs can help prevent erosion, which prevents sedimentation in our streams and rivers. So that's also kind of under agroforestry. So again, these are practices that are going to help our traditional agriculture be a little bit more ecologically friendly. So we can have both, and that's what we work for under this system. Okay. I'm going to quit sharing. I'll put those resources in the chat box. Any questions? It's kind of a broad topic. Again, most of my questions come about forest farming or about silvopasture, because those are the two things that people are interested in and think that they can put in place on their property. So, and just a quick reminder, next week, while everyone's thinking about questions that they have, next week we will have Andy Riddle on. She is a private lands conservationist with Missouri Department of Conservation, and she is going to be discussing improving turkey habitat on your property. And so we thought that it was good timing for that, since we are coming upon turkey season next week. Any questions today? Like I said, next week is turkey habitat. Good. I hope you found some information that was useful. I know it's when I first started, working in natural resources, agroforestry seemed like just really remote from what we do in Missouri. But then kind of come to find out that there's things that we can do that are under that agroforestry piece that are very applicable and very, very conservation oriented even. So you, let's see, a couple questions here. I'm going to put this last. Oh, how do you seed for forage in a forest setting? So depending where you are, so particularly if you're in the southern part of the state where it's a little hillier and you're thinking about putting in this type of setup, is you would seed, usually broadcast seeding. So we don't drill as much in our rockier areas. If you were in like the northern part of the state and thinking about kind of, perhaps you have open and you're going to plant trees, then you could consider like drilling your seeds in. But yeah, usually broadcast seeding. And then a question about it needs to be more flat forest versus hilly. So most of the pictures do show flat. Again, most of our research has come from pine plantations, which is in a lot flatter parts of the Southeast US, but you can have success even in our hillier parts of Missouri. It makes it a little trickier for if you're going to just perhaps harvest your forage, like hay it versus graze it. And it can get a little trickier on the fencing issues of because we usually try to set up again, kind of those rotational grazing systems. So it can get a little trickier with the hills, but not impossible. Okay, like I said, next week is turkey habitat. And then April 26th, we're going to talk about mushroom cultivation, particularly using woody debris to cultivate those mushrooms. So I usually talk about shiitake and oyster. I think this month I'm going to add some different species to the talk. And we'll discuss some of the other, like you can cultivate them, but aren't as common, just because that's always interesting to learn about, what all can you plant or cultivate as mushrooms go. So I still haven't found any morels myself this year. So if you're foraging for mushrooms, I'm not the person to ask because I've had zero luck this year. All right. Well, if there's not any other questions, I will see you next week. I recorded, so that will also be sent out if you want to revisit the recording. All right. Have a great rest of the week.